We've got Dave Blakely of IDEO, Jonathan Heiliger of Northbridge Venture Partners, and you should also know Jonathan was at Facebook, so he's had a little bit to know about changing the game. And then our own Michael Moon of the Moon Agency. And the discussion here is about change by design or change by accident. And with that, I'd like to go and bring up Dave and Jonathan and Michael Moon. Please join me in welcoming them up to the stage.
Well, where do you guys want to start? I guess we could start with the title. Design by change or design by accident? We've actually had the pleasure of sitting down and talk about a little bit of this before. I'm actually a strong advocate of change by accident. I think design is purposeful, but that change is an accident in our random and chaotic universe. There's no way that we can control everything that goes on in it. The illusion of control is perhaps the best thing that we can do, and I believe that design is a reactive mechanism, one that's possibly an evolutionary measure that we've used to cope with all the change around us. But I know that some other people over here have some different opinions about how change actually happens.
Well, at this point, I'm going to take issue with my distinguished colleague and new friend, Michael Moon. I simply cannot accept the notion of change by accident. I simply cannot accept the notion that change, and some of the most exciting changes that we're experiencing these days, are the result of random, unpredictable, and inherently uncontrollable processes, Michael. I think that at best, it's a little shy to say that, and at worst, it can even be defeatist. I believe, and everything in my design experience tells me, that while the precise rollout of any major change in the world, a new product, a new service, a new government initiative, for example, while the precise rollout is always unpredictable, always needs to be course corrected, and is always subject to change, it's in my professional and life experience that change can absolutely be designed. Jonathan, where do you sit?
So I sit probably on the extreme end, I guess, which is I'm taking the position that change is actually the result of good design, and that there have been many transformative changes in not only society but in technology over the last 20, 30 years that have been a result of someone having an idea, expressing that idea, and then bringing it out to the market and convincing people to buy into their way of thinking or their solution to either a problem that is known and defined, in the case that change may be the result of a reaction, or in the case of sort of other systems, staying generic for the moment, of problems that people didn't know existed or society didn't know that they had until they were actually sort of put in front of this change and experienced it for the first time.
I'm going to put it back in your court, Dave, because I think that design actually it is a reactive mechanism. I don't think that anybody changes unless they absolutely have to. Look at any evolutionary process, right? Nature takes a long time to create change, and it does so accidentally, experimentally, and it consumes a lot of energy in doing that. Any organism, any organization has a choice to make. They can either spend their energy reproducing or growing, or spend their energy changing, evolving into something new. And I think that whether that choice is made unconsciously, as it is in nature, and unguided, or consciously, as it is in the human experience, that's a balance that has to occur. And I think that design is, if change is accidental, design is a guided but reactionary kind of thing. I would put it in the psychological context and say, okay, you're just at the 5th stage right now. Okay, you've gone through denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance, and now you're in design.
So talking to you, I find this to be a really interesting construct because what you're contending, if I understand correctly, is that we're talking about a process that is almost sequential. If all of you visualize a couple of arcs, if I understand correctly, and we can focus more on this, what Michael is describing is a world in which change occurs first. An arc of change occurs first, an inherently unpredictable and massive change of some sort, and then design is a purposeful response to that change. It's interesting for me to hear about this because everything in my world has those two arcs moving simultaneously. Everything in my world has to do with a constant interplay between designers who are trying to create new things in the world based on study and experimentation, combined with large megatrends that might be anything from the increasing urbanization of the world to challenges to providing potable water in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance. So, I mean, let me give you an example here. When Bank of America challenged us to come up with some ideas to help middle-class and lower-middle-class homes in the United States to manage their finances, okay? What we did was to visualize a future in which people had better and more intimate controls over their finances. We visualized a change, in this case a business change in Bank of America that allowed them to better retain and better attract customers, because churn is a huge business problem for so many banks and so many other financial institutions, okay? In performing research and in engaging in design thinking, we made some really unexpected discoveries. For example, we found that in many lower middle class homes in which there's a female financial head of the household, we discovered that there's a process of tricking yourself into thinking that you are spending more than you are by actually rounding up your checking account and your checkbook to an amount that is greater than what you wrote the check for, okay? And what we did was to propose a service in which we automated that process, okay? So it's through that interplay of design and overall change or major changes that we're able to get Bank of America years ago to the point where they were able to measure a much improved rate of attracting and retaining good customers, okay? I'm not going to say that we designed something in a boardroom and then it played out exactly as planned, but I do see major change, in this case business change, along with design activities as running exactly in parallel with close interplay between the two of them.
Simultaneous and
exactly right.
My change curve just happens before the design curve, and I think you're on the other end of the scale where your design curve happens first.
And so in that Bank of America example, did that change lead to a change in consumer? Excuse me. Did that design then lead to a change in consumer behavior?
The design led to a change in consumer behavior, but as with so many other design projects, it's not as simple as saying, we did this and the result was the following change in behavior. What you had was an iterative process of successively more higher fidelity prototypes and more sophisticated offers to an increasingly large piece of their market, which was constantly being course corrected along the way. So I would never claim a causal relationship where we did something on some small scale and that led to an enormous change. But what I would claim is a steady interplay of, you know, where we made steady modifications to what it is we had put out for Bank of America in order to affect a major change in parallel with the design activities.
Got it. I mean, and just to take maybe a slightly different and but very contemporary example of the internet, I recently left Facebook, which has garnered a lot of attention not only for changing society for the better, but maybe also changing people's behaviors when they least expect it. And one of the products that was launched very early on in the company was a product called Newsfeed, which quite simply brought news to you on a single pane or a single linear timeline feed from all around you, from your friends, from your relatives, from people you were connected with. And these news stories could be everything from birthdays to photos that were shared to today stories and articles that are being read. And you know, fundamentally that was something that at the time caused a significant uproar in the community of users. And there were about 15 million people that used Facebook at the time, and about almost 20% of those people, I think, ended up signing a petition to actually pull this feature back from the site because they hated it so much. And in reality, maybe this plays into Michael's thinking a little bit. This was a change that was reacting to something that was already happening in society, which is people would come together in a room and exchange ideas and updates and photos of each other, and instead bringing it front and center to your daily life. But the real design change, I think, that was unique and different in this sort of mode of consuming information from all around you, was now you could look through your friends and look through your family's eyes at how they see the world. And as a result, I think the consumer of that information had a totally different view of the world. And just to maybe put a point to that, so I now read news on politics and on events happening elsewhere in the world that I would never have otherwise seen, because my friends are reading it and because my family is reading it. And as such, it becomes interesting to me and it's surfaced to me, and it changes my perspective and kind of and the global lens that I look out to the world on.
My experience has sometimes been exactly the opposite. And it's because people change, or at least they start to engage in the process of design and think about how they're changing because they see what's going on around them. And it's the stuff that's outside of their control that forces them to do that. Great example of this, I do a lot of communication design and message development for everything from politicians and causes to companies. With the surge of YouTube and Vimeo and now you can get anything on demand at any time, and we're just bombarded with media, people started to realize that, you know what, if I need to get my ideas across, I can't simply do that through an editorial or a standard PowerPoint presentation or whatever it is. I've got to do something to kick it up a notch, right? And the only reason they were encouraged to do something like that was because they said, I'm losing mind share. And it was because of all the other stuff in the world going on around them that was outside of their control that they changed. Now, I don't think design always functions like that, but I think that it is probably more accurate to say that design happens as a responsive mechanism as opposed to an agent of change, even though there's great examples of that happening. I mean, I think about the beginning of this country, right? And yeah, you can say it was a reaction against Triple George and all that, but really it was, hey, we've got a whole new frontier. We've got an opportunity here. Let's redesign government. And if you want to talk about a design challenge, that's a huge one, right? That's almost like the ultimate pinnacle of what design should be all about. And so there are instances throughout history where design does come first, where people do have that blank slate and they can say, we've never done anything like this before, and we're going to change the world by doing it. How are we going to do that? But there's these other instances where unless you've got the leadership, unless you've got the money, unless you've got the resources, then I think that oftentimes we are, a lot of people are reluctant to change. And they have to get forced into the place where they're made to do it, because otherwise they won't. Good. But once they get forced there, right, the best way to do that is to take the purposeful approach, right, and not to experiment and not to waste time and energy thinking about all these different ways that we can do this, but to take that design approach that says, let's be purposeful about this, let's plan it out, let's knock out the alternatives that we know aren't going to work from the get-go, right, so that when we do change, it's the most effective change that we can create.
We met a week ago at IDEO to talk about our perspectives on change. As the audience can see, we had three rather divergent perspectives on the relationship between design and change, but all three of us agreed on one thing, and that is that we really wanted to involve you just as early as possible. We do have mic runners, and we think it's very important to consider this a discussion, even though this is a relatively large group, rather than any sort of presentation. So at this point, we'd like to open up the conversation to you, and in particular, we'd like you to square up three perspectives that we've presented to you against your life experience and some of the important things, or some of the trends that you think are important. You're hearing a perspective about design as fundamentally reactive and responsive to inherently unpredictable trends. You're hearing a perspective about design, effective design moving in parallel with those trends and with major changes, social changes, demographic changes, political, religious, what have you. And you also heard a little bit of a perspective about good design actually causing, in a clear causal relationship, major changes. Think about some of the, go ahead.
What's interesting about this is that for all of us, even though we have different perspectives, I think design is equally important. It's one of the most important things that we can do, and I think we're all in agreement on that. So if you have the fourth perspective, which is you don't care about design at all,
Yeah. We'd love to hear that.
That would be
Please feel free to share.
Yeah, if you want to stick it off the stage, you can tell us that too.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. If you don't care about design, we'll take that outside.
Yeah. So we'd love to hear from you. Tell us about some events that you're thinking of that you're using to contextualize this conversation and what your feelings are. And we'll ask the mic runners to look for people with their hands raised, and then please stand when you have the point that you want to make.
Right here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, suppose you're in some
Go ahead and
big,
stand up.
Yeah. Suppose you're in some big nameless company, right? And they're headed off in the wrong direction. They think that they're innovating, and really they're just twiddling the knobs on the deck chairs of the Titanic. And you have some good innovation in mind. How do you speak truth to power?
One
Carefully.
way, yeah. One way to speak truth to power is to let other people do the speaking for you. Okay? One way to speak truth to power is if, for example, you're working for a corporation that is making incremental changes to an offer that you believe is fundamentally flawed and fundamentally not business viable, which unfortunately in my observation describes a lot of businesses, okay? If you and I get into it, I say it's no good and you say it's great. Where's that conversation going to go? We both know that's not going to go anywhere. Video's cheap. Video editing is cheap and fast. If I've got 5 diverse people, from this high school student to this single mom to this elderly pensioner, all talking about why your cell phones are in trouble, or your healthcare service isn't working for them, or your style of housing is not appropriate, all of a sudden I've got a diverse set of people who've got my back. And that's one approach that I can take because it externalizes the turf between us, right? If you and I both have turf to protect, we're going to butt heads. But if we're committed to our customers and I'm able to demonstrate empathically that the customers are unhappy, the CEO should listen.
That customer empathy, I can't agree with that more. I was doing some work with a local city agency recently, and you get a lot of people in there they're lifers. They've been around at this organization for 20, 30 years. They come to work every day. They're not really sure why they come to work, and or what they're doing. And they're I love your mixed metaphor of twiddling the knobs on the deck chairs of the Titanic. But to be able to reframe their focus on that customer, right? To be able to have them recognize who it is that they're actually serving on a day-to-day basis. This is actually a local art museum, and in reinventing them, we asked everybody on the staff to ask themselves every morning when they came into work, who am I serving? And every time somebody came through the door, to say, that person's an artist. And it didn't matter whether they were a 4-year-old kid or a 74-year-old potter or somebody who's just in a gallery viewing, everyone is an artist. And all of a sudden, everybody got together and said, I'm going to treat everybody with that kind of respect. And the entire atmosphere changed. Just because they started to think about who was walking through the door and not the filing system that they had to manage or the putting paint on the walls or whatever else it was. Transformed the whole thing.
And I think, Michael's point about listening to, both their points about listening to customers or even thinking about your customer, I think is a great basis to begin with. I think another approach to take is also just to think about how you can prototype an idea. So, whether it's a careful approach or a radical approach to making a suggestion to someone who's spending all their time twiddling knobs and dials, being able to prototype things on your own and then bringing back almost proof, if you will, whether that's from customers, from your constituents and potential audience, or even just that design A is actually superior to design B because you're able to prototype. Obviously, maybe you can't design a nuclear power plant that way, but I would probably postulate that many products and services, technical or not, can be prototyped very quickly and easily. And I would point everyone to look at either your children or your friends' children's classrooms and how much prototyping actually happens in elementary school classrooms, and most of that being funded by the school teacher themselves, like kind of out of their own pocket, not part of the school's curriculum per se.
Yeah. In this particular case, the customer doesn't have the product yet, but it's been announced in reviews, and the reviews are terrible. But everybody inside the company is afraid to say anything.
Yeah, that may, sometimes you have to acknowledge to yourself, that may be no win. It happens. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I met the other day Google's Jolly Good Fellow, that's his title, is Chade Meng Tang, and he was an engineer, and he decided to go into human resources, actually. And what he's designed is a way for inner peace, and inner peace, looking inside yourself, so the program is meditating and looking inside yourself and making changes in the world. And part of that is looking inside yourself, making changes, and then designing new changes. And so changing from everything's around you and everything that you see inside and things that you want to see, and then creating that change with mindfulness.
I think if we had more of that, we'd be much more over on Dave's side, where change is driving things. Like I say, I think change is reactive because I think most people are resistant to it. But it doesn't have to be that way. If we had more of that kind of thinking, right, we'd have more people willing to change and more people willing to step into a design thinking process that would enable it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry, could you...
Something might just pop up out of meditation and then happen organically as well, what you're saying.
Yeah, if you're open to it,
right,
it's much more likely to happen.
So I think maybe one of the problems is trying to think of change and design as being these like juggernauts, and either change is completely fueled by design or vice versa. Is it possible that for different industries and for different sectors that it's going to change based on the situation? You can't apply a model to every situation. And do you think that almost having this discussion there's no answer, really?
Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting possibility. I think that one possible outcome of this is that we've created a very simple taxonomy of 3 lenses by which one can look at the intersection of change and design, and that depending on, say, the particular vertical market or industry you're looking at, or even the nature of the design challenge you're taking on and how much ambiguity it has, that it may make more sense to think of design as responsive to change as compared to design as driving change. What do you folks think?
I mean, I think, I guess I would agree that I would almost view these as maybe different phases or different approaches to transforming a business or an industry or a society, and that at different points in time, different approaches may be necessary, but that everyone probably inside themselves has a default mode. And for entrepreneurs, it tends to be design-led change, because you're trying to create something where there was nothing. Yeah. And you can get there in sort of one of 2 ways, arguably, and it's a continuum. But one way is by looking at the pattern of data in front of you and reacting to that, and designing a product to solve a particular problem. And another is that sort of inspiration, that inspiration moment that just comes to you, and you decide to build something or create something that hasn't existed before. And I think they both work, but I do think that they can be applied almost simultaneously to I wouldn't say every problem, but I'd say nearly every problem.
I think the phase model is actually interesting. Ask yourself, what kind of situation am I in right now? What kind of company am I in right now? And is it the kind of situation that's going to be open to design that doesn't need that kind of encouragement? Or do you have to go out and create random acts of chaos and disorder and strife in order to get people into the mindset, oh wait, we need to do something about this right now? And so that's where I think the lenses might actually be very interesting, is to say, do I push design right now, or do I create change myself in a way to get people to react to one or the other of those things? Where do I lead with? Mm-hmm. But you're right, depending on the industry and the time, who knows?
Bill Veltrup here. I'd like to put a slightly different twist on your statement, Michael, your assertion about people resisting change. been involved in change work in large corporate systems for about 35 years. And what I found is that everyone resists being changed. But inherent in humans is a natural drive toward innovation and exploring change. And so the strategy in supporting change in large systems needs to be to create a context that invites people to really tap into their fullest genius, if you will. And then magic can happen.
Can you talk a little bit more about, that's a wonderful statement. Can you talk to the audience a little bit more about that? It is our experience that organizations are fundamentally change averse, and I would love to hear a little bit more about how you've locked up that essential and sort of elemental human quality that welcomes change and welcomes exploring change. Because it is our experience that large organizations are typically and appropriately structured to entirely on delivering around their current offer. And everyone is entirely motivated and often measured and incentivized based on those goals. And as such, change is a big threat, and change is extraordinarily difficult.
Organizations have been designed for stability, for producing what they're producing as efficiently, effectively, and cost-effectively as possible.
Sure.
They're designed to resist change. They're designed with a very narrow definition of success. They're designed with the notion that in order to be a complex organization, we have to have structures that control people.
Yes.
So it's a frigging design problem. The organizations can be designed to unleash the potential of people. They can be designed with broader definitions and must be designed for broader definitions of success. They must be designed for learning and change, and they aren't today.
Give us, if you can, if they're not confidential, give us a case study of even a small-scale experiment. I think we'd all love to hear about this, in which change was successfully made less threatening, more palatable to a large organization.
It was one of the most defining moments in my life. It was very early in my profession as a change person within Exxon Corporation. And I discovered, I befriended a fellow named Herb Stokes of Procter & Gamble. And Procter & Gamble had a proprietary approach to organization design that's based on living systems theory rather than the mechanistic model. And there they went for change in a big way in their manufacturing area, so a number of their manufacturing plants were designed on this basis. So they designed a plant, paper-making plant, in Albany, Georgia. They built this plant in 1973. So this was in the height of the racial tensions and in the place, in the area where it was greatest. They designed that plant with a technician team basis, semi-autonomous technician teams. They started out with 40% African Americans, 20% women. Both of those were radical changes. There was no support in the community from anybody for that. And they did it because they felt that it would be better design, and it has been. And they have beat competition for 35 years now, 38 years, 30, more than that, 40 almost, years, because they designed the organization so that they made people at the workplace responsible not only for their work, but for developing their relationships with each other, for managing their own development, for managing the boundary relationships with other teams. And you look at the group, this team, and it looked like, well, it's sort of a classic McDonald team. Mm-hmm. But they were performing more effectively, more genius there in terms of their interactions than you would find in boardrooms or management committees. That plant did more to develop women leadership and African American leadership throughout Procter & Gamble than any other plant within there. You found these people who are technicians would be mayors of the adjacent cities. So this is back in '73. I've not found anyone or any plant that has topped it since then.
I think it's an interesting point that you raised because I'd love to see more of that. You know, I think people are resistant to change when either, you know, A, there's risk of a downside, a loss, B, when there's no clear path forward, or C, when someone's doing it to you, as you identified, right? You know, you get rid of those things and you design for change, and I think it becomes much easier for people to do that. The question that I have about that is, again, as you identified, organizations are designed for structural solidity, for, you know, long-term focus, for stability, is at what point does that redesigning become its own calcified plan, right? And re-stymies design.
Yeah, when do you disrupt the disruption?
Exactly.
Yeah, good.
Or I've been a change leader as an executive within companies over time, and I think it's an interesting point that there's a practicality that starts to be divorced from whatever the effort is throughout the iterations of whether it's design or its intention. I think it's just interesting when you see that a dramatic moment has to be created within a group or a team or whatever you're trying to change. And from that dramatic moment, you get all the reactions. You know, it's the shock treatment to see what happens. You have to have an intuitive, nurturing design to be able to understand how to unlock the next step. And it's interesting. It's sort of a basic comment, but I see it time and time again where you can take the best of every intention within a thought process. If you don't have the interconnectivity, really going back to why do junior high students, you know, why are they more malleable? Because there isn't the bias. There isn't the fear of what happens to me. There's let me just say what I'm thinking. And that nature, being in large public companies as well as small companies, starts to get lost, I think, more and more. So right now we're seeing this resurgence. Speaking of change management, it's just amazing right now how large companies and small are really looking at, oh my gosh, we've got to, you know, invest in change management and, you know, all the design work going into that. But it still comes down to the practical part of that. And it's that dramatic moment turning into a nurturing environment to then spark really what is end-to-end client experience, whether the client is a team of people that have to change because of a necessary result. But it's such an interconnected ecosystem of, you know, change is holistic again, just from a street smart practical perspective, having done it in companies for a long time.
So let me make sure I understand your point, because I think the audience would like to, you know, take away some of your wisdom as a professional change manager. You know, if I understand correctly, you're talking about what we might consider almost as countermeasures to this problem that we see so often, which is that grinding operational realities of any large organization can so often smother good ideas, smother good new initiatives, and smother change. Would that be?
Yes, and just to clarify, I'm not an expert or executive change management. I'm actually, at this point, I'm in a management consulting firm,
sure.
Leading that effort, but came from consumer products, actually worked for Nordstrom Corporation for many years in leadership. It's interesting to look at total client experience, whether your client is an end consumer, it is an internal group, it is, you know, a child for that matter. And you look at how to unlock what is the power of the dramatic moment, then becoming the catalyst, you know, that's the catalyst. How do you then get all that is available out of that individual or that team or that, you know, that customer interaction? That's a very holistic piece of what then becomes all the change management effort, you know, no matter what you're trying to affect the change in. There's a practicality that is lost with more and more iterations. So working with management consultants, obviously the whole nature of the job, whether you're doing an M&A, you know, acquisition integration project or whatever, is to figure out the soft skill dynamic that's necessary in order for that thing to work. So you see hugely successful acquisitions and then, of course, dramatic failures. They still come down to the human component. That's the dramatic change has to be introduced to say, we've got to do something different. Everyone, you know, there's a fear moment, and then it's from there, how do you design something that does not stifle the process that humans still have to come together? That interconnectivity
and it's been mentioned several times, Mr. Williams mentioned it today as well, that there has to be this thought that comes to the table from different stakeholder perspectives that then can be captured, because to me, change isn't about control, it's about capturing and then getting the essence out of it to become something bigger than itself. So it's more of an observation, but.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Someone in the back.
Hi, so I'm going to change the theme here from inspiring to the greedy side, but I'm curious to the panel, what are your views on the new paradigm of crowdsourcing programs like Kickstarter and contrasting that against IP protection? How do you throw a truly valuable idea out there for collaboration, but being able to protect it, or sort of just what your thoughts or experiences are on that?
Sure, I'm happy to respond, and then we can go around. So, first of all, let's be clear. There's no arguing with the success of, frankly, a game changer and a change agent like Kickstarter. PricewaterhouseCoopers tells us that in 2011, there was $1 billion of very early stage seed capital invested, and of that very early stage seed capital, 93 million, so nearly 10 cents out of every dollar, came from Kickstarter. So that's remarkable in something new as Kickstarter that's grown virally. So I'm glad you brought these up, because I think we should be paying attention to them. We're crowdsourcing and open innovation, which are often described in the same breath, in my opinion, are at risk of being overhyped and overapplied. And I think back to some of the thoughts about taxonomy and appropriate application of different methods at the right time, we must ask ourselves, and we must develop much more sophistication about understanding, when is crowdsourcing the right thing to do? When is crowdfunding of some idea appropriate? Intellectual property is just one of many issues that we must consider when all of us in our organizations are deciding whether crowdfunding is, crowdsourcing is appropriate, and whether open innovation is appropriate as well. So I would point to examples of extremely well-applied open innovation. Everybody's probably familiar with this. When Google was seeking to come up with a good and viable competitive response to Apple, obviously they were aware that at the time Android was being released, Google had 250,000 applications in its App Store. Now it has many more, of course. By appropriate application of open innovation, in this case an open innovation contest, in which they distributed a beautifully designed software development kit, and they created democratized rules around the whole world for app developers, along with cash prizes. Nearly overnight, Google had 70,000 applications of their own, which is a good and viable competitive response to what Apple had done. So there's a really good application of open innovation. Another good application I would list of open innovation is, I believe that a great many companies need to come to the realization that the last word on new product introduction and the last word on new services for so many industries and so many products is not in the hands of the manufacturer anymore. It's in the hands of the customer. And a combination of platforms that whose behavior can be completely changed with software downloads and hacking, like a Microsoft Kinect or an iPhone, combined with the incredible democratization of that knowledge that comes from the internet, well, that's leading to a global network of sharing and crowdsourced hacking culture that's going to lead to some really exciting areas. So I bring those up as two areas in which crowdsourcing, open innovation, and open communication is of high value and is very exciting to bring to bear and very exciting to apply. But there are a heck of a lot of situations in business and in a number of other domains where crowdsourcing is not appropriate and where open innovation is not suitable. And I think, as I said, we just need to be a lot more sophisticated in how we apply it. Sorry to ramble.
I do think it's absolutely it's how we apply it. But I think platforms like Kickstarter or, generally speaking, marketplaces where you're connecting people that can either make a good or a product and people that want to buy that good or product are good for our society and are good for technological innovation and even innovations of maybe the more mundane kind, like furniture, where there's a business that got started a couple of months ago on the East Coast called CustomMade.com. And if you're a furniture maker, a craftsman in New Hampshire or wherever you happen to live, you may not have a ability to reach customers for your products, and to be able to post them on a particular marketplace, whether that's one website or another, I think enables that small business to exist and blossom in ways that it might not have been able to do without crowdfunding or mechanisms like that. I think as it relates to creating a business versus creating a product, I do think there's a delineation there. And as Dave was saying, I think that there are many more nuances as to when crowdfunding makes sense to apply versus using it as a mechanism to essentially have your customers fund your first or even second or third iteration of product directly without having to sort of go through the process of thinking about building a business and instead just focusing on the craftsman element of designing a product, building a product, and shipping a product out to someone.
I'm thrilled that crowdsourcing has finally descended. I look at it though as the proper application of that technique, and I go back to your kind of traditional design process. In some ways, we've always had crowdsourcing. To take one very finite example, if you're doing something like a logo mark, the first step is to generate as many concepts as you possibly can. You don't want one designer sitting there looking at their computer screen until their forehead bleeds, trying to come up with all these different ideas, right? You want everybody in your design agency to show up tomorrow with 5 ideas, right? And then you put them all up on the board. Right? But then there's a process called refinement. And you don't want everybody engaged in the refinement aspect of the process. But then you have evaluation. And you need all those voices to hear back and get the feedback in mass from that again. And then there's execution, which again, you don't want everyone to be involved in necessarily, but a few people. So I think it's cyclical. It's about the right application of when do you open this up to everybody, and when do you have a core group of people who can take all that information, process it, refine it, condense it, and turn it into something magical.
We are just about out of time, but we'd love to hear one last comment.
Thanks. Back one speaker, you were talking about the people thing involved.
Yeah.
Jonathan, in Facebook, I'm sure you had people just whipping up ideas, hourly
Left and right.
minutely. How do you stop the scope creep? Because what we find is we get into an organization or something new, and there's X idea on the table. Then they go, oh, wait, we can add this. And then we add this, and then nothing gets done. Yeah. So how do you all address that?
Sure. So I think one of the things we didn't get to talk about that's probably a longer subject for another day is how to enact change or how to enact design. And I think there have been many successful companies, if we look through history, where they are sort of founder-led or led by a single person, and maybe even if that person changes over a period of time, versus companies or transformations that are led by collaborations and by bringing people together and bringing them into the process to work together as a team. And ultimately, I think we can point to lots of examples of both methods being successful, but I think one of the best ways of keeping the design as simple as possible and the product as simple as possible, which I'd argue is actually one of the most challenging aspects of designing and building anything, is how to keep it simple and back to first principles, is to have a very small number, even if that number is one, of people that are sort of ultimately the decision makers to the sort of process that Michael just ran us through. In that sort of ultimate end conclusion, you can have people involved all the way up until the end of refinement and evaluation and contributing. But if there's a single person at the end who says, like, I'm putting my name on the line and we're going to go this direction, I think that's generally the fastest, not always the nicest, way to have generally the fastest, not the nicest way of maintaining scope creep or preventing scope creep. Correct.
Good. Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for all your comments.
Okay, now please welcome Joe Dinucci to give a quick idea bite.
Hi, I'm Joe. and this is a humbling experience. Although you must know, when I open my refrigerator door and the light comes on, I do 5 minutes. So now we've heard amazing morning. I'm really just love being here and have people tell us about how to innovate and how to break through, how to scale. So I'm going to humbly offer my thoughts about how to live. And what I'm thinking about, I'll start with a quote I'll pirate from Thomas Friedman. He had a very good column on Sunday's New York Times. And he quoted someone else to redefine illiteracy in our time. And he said, illiteracy used to mean the difference between being able to read and not read. And that's irrelevant today. Today, the relevant description of illiteracy is the difference between being able to learn and not learn. It doesn't matter how old or how young you are. You could be just finishing your doctorate from Stanford, and as we heard earlier, pretty much by the time graduation ceremony is over, you're irrelevant. You have to learn how to continue to think and how to process information, the infinite amount of which is at your fingertips. So I'll offer 2 thoughts for you that I've learned as a 32 years in the Valley, and I'll offer this. I think if you can cultivate the ability to hold 2 thoughts in your head at the same time, which of course is impossible. You're a human being, you can hold 1 thought at a time. But if you can toggle back and forth between these 2 thoughts, I think it will help. 1, you're impatient. You're unsatisfied with the status quo. It's essential to be an entrepreneur. It's essential to be an innovator. You are just, whatever it isn't good enough. It's good, it's not great. I love my new iPhone 5, but if only it could do this or that. There's something about the status quo you're living with that you want to see change. That generates gestalt, it generates energy, a passion. You find a way to move forward and execute and do something about it. That's a wonderful and essential ingredient to be an entrepreneur. And if that's all you have, I can pretty much guarantee you will burn out. The contrasting thought I want you to cultivate and to hold and to practice is gratitude. That you hold a thought from time to time throughout your day of just a conscious gratitude that you're alive, you're healthy, your physical safety is not in danger, you have work that you care about, you have a family, friends, people in your life, things in your life that matter to you, that you've accumulated, that you treasure and savor. And if you can toggle between those 2 states of mind, between an impatience with the status quo and a gratitude and a savoring for the life that you get to live, you can, I believe, not only succeed, but survive the process of succeeding. That's my thought.
Thank you, Joe. And we now have a second idea bite, a bite before lunch, as it were, with Jonathan Dippert.
Thanks. Am I the first person to talk about standing on a soapbox and pontificating today? Apparently. Joe, great. I love the 5-minute part. The other thing is Naveen. I really love the energy that he brought to the room. So thank you so much. I wish I had that level of passion and energy, but I just need to make it happen, right? Thank you. So Karen asked me to talk just a few minutes ago, and my immediate reaction was to not change, to say, I can't do this. I have too much, it's like, what am I going to say? So what I'd like to talk about just briefly are, in my personal experience, what are some of the barriers to change, and then how have I made some changes? And there's lots of research. I've studied neuroscience, I've studied psychology, I've studied biology, in addition to IT. So I have things to back it up, but I really, in just 3 minutes, just want to talk about some personal experiences. So the first thing I've found is when I'm confronted with a change, and I'm sure all of us have that, or most of us have this, there may be an immediate reaction, I can't do it, or I don't want to change. It's easier to just do what I'm doing right now. And what I have found is one of the ways I get around this is I take a brief moment and I can actually get from a state of anxiety to a state of calm. And I find I need to be in a state of calm, almost meditative, not quite, but almost meditative. And that in that, I can see possibilities, I can see things I couldn't just a few minutes earlier, where I was stuck in anxiety or just moving fast or responding to 30 emails, that morning, that sort of thing. So The first part of what I need to do is actually just step back and get into, step back's not the right word. I need to calm and center myself and really get to a zone where I can just say, and I'm using a lot of buzzwords, okay? Meditation zone, flow, I should throw that out too. But anyway, really it's mostly getting into a calm state where I can think and see other possibilities. And that's the first thing I need to do. And once I see it, I see the first step. What's the first step that I need to do to change? And then even though I don't want to do it, I force myself to do it. And that's really where I found I've been able to do the most change in things. And the other comment I have two ideas. The first one is getting into that calm state. And the second one is I use a multidisciplinary approach. I'm in IT. It's a field that is not always the most exciting. IT support, I have an IT support firm. And one thing that I found, and I can see other possibilities, is to take a multidisciplinary approach. I've studied neuroscience, I've studied other things, but I've also studied improv, and I've studied the arts. And I find, one time I actually got stuck, and I took an improv workshop, and I was driving home from the improv workshop, and I had solved my problem in my business. And I'm like, how the heck did that happen? But I'm finding that this multidisciplinary approach really does help, especially if you combine it with other areas that don't seem to be very connected. And those are my two thoughts. I'm getting the light, so I'm going to have to get off the soapbox. Hope everyone has a great lunch.